I keep a tin of peppermints in my cardigan pocket. It started years ago when I quit smoking, and I never broke the habit. Every morning, I reach in, find one, and something about that little ritual tells me the day has officially begun. My daughter used to tease me about it. She'd say, "Mom, you're the only person in America still carrying peppermints like it's 1987. And I'd say, "Honey, some things don't need updating." That was before. The text came on a Wednesday morning in November. I remember because I had just gotten back from my walk, 3 miles around the neighborhood, same route I've done since Gerald passed, and I was still in my jacket, still catching my breath when my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. It was from my son-in-law, not my daughter, my son-in-law. "Hey, Patricia, Gwen and I have been talking. We think it makes more sense for us to take over the cabin going forward. We'll handle the taxes, the upkeep, everything. You don't have to worry about it anymore. More details soon." I read it 3 times. Then I put the phone face down on the counter, took off my jacket, hung it on the hook by the door, went to the kitchen sink, and washed my hands. I don't know why I washed my hands. They weren't dirty. I think I just needed something to do while my brain caught up to what my eyes had just read. The cabin. My cabin. Let me tell you about that cabin. Gerald and I found the land in 2003. We were driving back from visiting his sister in Asheville, North Carolina, and we took a wrong turn somewhere off Highway 74. Not a dangerous wrong turn, just one of those slow, winding roads that takes you through somebody else's countryside. And there was a hand-painted sign, blue letters on a white board, stuck in the ground at an angle like it had been there a long time. It said, 12 acres. Motivated seller. Gerald pulled over without saying a word. We walked the property for an hour. It was November then, too, which strikes me as something now. The leaves were mostly down, and you could see the ridgeline through the bare trees. And there was a creek that ran along the eastern edge, that made a sound I can only describe as permanent. Like it had been making that sound before we were born, and would keep making it long after. We bought it 4 months later. It took us 9 years to build the cabin, not because we were slow, but because we did it the right way. We paid cash for each phase. Saved, built, saved, built, saved. Gerald was a mechanical engineer and I was a high school librarian, and between the two of us, we had exactly 0 construction experience. But we had stubbornness and weekends and a very patient contractor named Roy who grew to consider us family. The porch took 2 summers because Gerald kept changing his mind about the railing posts. He wanted them to be right. He didn't live to see the fireplace finished. He passed in the spring of 2014. Heart attack. Sudden and complete. He was 67 years old and had just started talking about retirement, and then he was gone in the time it takes to make a cup of coffee. I finished the cabin anyway. I want you to understand what that means. I finished it without him. I drove up from Charlotte on weekends by myself, and I made decisions by myself, and I sat on that unfinished porch by myself, and ate sandwiches, and looked at the ridgeline and talked to him out loud sometimes because the mountain didn't care, and neither did I. I used part of his life insurance and part of my pension and every spare dollar I had for 3 years. When Roy poured the last of the flagstone for the fireplace hearth, I sat down on it right there and cried for 45 minutes. The cabin was finished in 2017. I was 63 years old. I had built it, in every way that matters, with my own 2 hands and my own grief and my own love. My daughter Gwen had always loved the cabin. That part is true, and I want to be fair about it. When she was little, she used to sit on the porch railing, the same railing her father kept redesigning, and watch the deer come down to the creek at dusk. She brought her college roommates up one Thanksgiving, and they played cards until 2 in the morning. She and her husband Marcus had their anniversary up there twice. Marcus. I need to be careful how I talk about Marcus because Gwen is still my daughter, and I love her, and the story isn't really about hating him. It's about understanding, too late, how someone can move so gradually you don't notice the direction of travel until you're somewhere you never agreed to go. Marcus is in commercial real estate. He has a talent for looking at spaces and seeing potential, and I mean that in the most literal sense. He cannot look at a space without calculating it. It's not greed exactly, it's just how his brain is wired. Everything is an asset, everything has a use case. He started making suggestions about the cabin about 2 years before that text message. Small things at first. Patricia, you should really look into renting this place out on Verbo. You'd make back your property taxes in a season. I smiled and said I didn't want strangers in my cabin. He nodded like he was filing that objection away. Then, Patricia, you know if you updated the kitchen it would hold its value so much better. I told him the kitchen was fine. It was fine. Then, the summer before the text, Patricia, Gwen and I have been thinking, what if we came up more often and kind of took on some of the management? You wouldn't have to make the drive as much. I said I liked the drive. I said the drive up 74 was one of my favorite things in the world, that it still felt like Gerald and I discovering the land all over again every time I made it. He smiled at that, and I thought the conversation was done. That November, after the text, I called my daughter. She picked up on the second ring, which told me she was waiting. Did you read it? She asked. I did. Marcus thought it would be better coming from him. Kind of like a business thing, you know? So it was clear and there was no confusion. I remember standing at my kitchen window looking out at the backyard, at the azalea bushes Gerald planted the year we moved in, and trying to keep my voice level. Gwen, I said, that cabin belongs to me. I know, Mom. Nobody's saying it doesn't. Your husband's text said you were going to take it over. Take over the management of it. The upkeep. You don't have to deal with all that anymore. I don't mind dealing with it. There was a pause. Then, Marcus thinks it would be a good investment property. He has a contact who can get it listed and we could split the rental income with you. You'd actually be making money instead of just paying taxes. I don't want to rent it. Mom, I don't want strangers sleeping in your father's bed. Another pause. Longer this time. We'll talk about it at Thanksgiving, she said. Thanksgiving that year was at their house in Raleigh. Their house is beautiful. Marcus does well, I'll say that. And the table was set perfectly and everything was warm and good, and I sat there and felt the whole thing like a negotiation happening underneath the meal. After dessert, when the kids were in the other room, Marcus laid out what he was calling the plan. They would take over the property, handle taxes, insurance, maintenance, list it on Verbo from January through October, keep it clear for family in November and December. Gwen and Marcus would be named on the deed for estate planning purposes, Patricia so there's no probate mess when the time comes, and they would manage all bookings and income. I would receive 30% of the rental proceeds, 30% of my own cabin. I asked him what would happen if I wanted to go up on a weekend. He said I'd need to check the booking calendar first and let them know at least 2 weeks in advance, 2 weeks' notice, to go to my own property. I did not raise my voice. I have never been a woman who raises her voice, and I wasn't going to start at my daughter's Thanksgiving table with the pumpkin pie still out. I said I'd think about it. I drove home that night instead of staying over like I usually do. Gwen texted me when I was halfway back to Charlotte, "You okay, Mom?" I said I was fine. I said I'd call her in the morning. I didn't call her in the morning. I need to tell you about my friend Ruth Ann. We've been friends for 31 years. We met at a library conference in Atlanta in the early 90s, back when people still had library conferences. She is from Tennessee. She has opinions about everything, and she is the person I call when I need someone to tell me the truth. I called her the Friday after Thanksgiving. I told her everything. The text, the Thanksgiving conversation, the 30%, the 2-week notice. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Patricia, they are trying to take your cabin. They're trying to help me manage it. They are using the language of help," she said, to describe taking. I sat with that for a long time. In January, Marcus started sending me links, Verbo listings in the Asheville area. Look at what comparable properties are making, Patricia. You're sitting on a gold mine and doing nothing with it. I stopped responding to the links. Then Gwen called and asked if I'd thought more about the plan. I said I was still thinking. She said Marcus had already talked to a lawyer about the deed transfer and it was very simple, really. Just a quitclaim document. Something changed in me when she said that. Not anger, exactly. Something colder than anger. I called my own attorney, a woman named Carol who did my estate planning after Gerald died, and I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which is one of her best qualities. When I finished, she said, "They cannot compel you to transfer the deed. You know that." I said I did, she said. "But they can make your life uncomfortable enough that you feel like you have no other choice." I said I was starting to understand that. She said, "What do you want to happen, Patricia?" I said I wanted to keep my cabin. She said, "Then let's make sure you do." February was when it escalated. Gwen called me on a Sunday night and she was crying. I hadn't heard my daughter cry like that since Gerald's funeral. She said Marcus was upset, that I was being difficult, that they were just trying to help me. She said the cabin was too much for one person to manage, especially at my age. Especially at my age. I'm 69 years old. I walk 3 miles a day. I drove to Asheville and back by myself last October in the rain. I had managed my own finances, my own home, my own life for the 11 years since I lost Gerald, and I have never once asked my daughter or anyone else to do it for me. I told Gwen that I loved her. I told her that I understood she was in a hard position, and then I told her that the cabin was mine, that I had built it in memory of her father, and that I was not going to transfer the deed to anyone. She stopped crying. She got quiet in a different way. "Marcus is going to be really upset," she said. "I know," I said. "I'm sorry about that." We said goodnight. I hung up and sat in my living room for a while in the dark, and I thought about the ridgeline, and the creek, and Roy the contractor, and a man who spent 2 summers getting the railing posts exactly right. In March, my attorney sent Marcus and Gwen a letter. It wasn't hostile, it was clear. It stated that I was the sole owner of the property, that I had no intention of transferring ownership or co-ownership under any arrangement, and that any further communication regarding the property should go through her office. Marcus called me the same day the letter arrived. I didn't answer. He left a voicemail. His voice was controlled, which somehow made it worse. He said I was being irrational. He said I was letting emotions cloud a straightforward financial decision. He said Gwen was devastated. I texted Gwen separately. "I love you. This has nothing to do with loving you. Call me when you're ready." She didn't call for 6 weeks. Those 6 weeks were the hardest part. Not the legal back and forth, not Marcus's voicemails, which I stopped listening to after the third one. The hardest part was the silence from my daughter. A mother's phone knows the difference between a quiet day and a deliberate one. Gwen had gone quiet in a way that felt pointed, and every morning I'd look at my phone and feel the weight of it. I went up to the cabin in April. I hadn't been since November, the longest I'd stayed away. The drive up 74 felt different without Gerald, and without the story of us discovering it together at the front of my mind. I pulled up the gravel drive and sat in the car for a minute before I got out. The cabin was exactly as I left it. I opened all the windows and let the mountain air come through. I made coffee and took it out to the porch and sat in the same chair I always sit in and looked at the ridgeline. The trees were just coming into bud. That particular green, that's almost yellow, Gerald always said April and the mountains was God showing off. I sat there for a long time, and I made a decision, not about the cabin, about myself. I realized that I had spent 6 months being afraid, not of losing the legal fight. Carol had made it clear I would win that, but afraid of my daughter's disapproval, afraid of being the difficult one, the unreasonable one, the old woman who wouldn't let go. I had spent 6 months softening my language, checking my tone, trying to be conciliatory in the face of something that didn't deserve conciliation. I was done with that. Gwen called in May. She said Marcus had calmed down. She said she'd been doing a lot of thinking. She said she was sorry for going quiet. I told her I was glad she called. She asked if we could talk about the cabin. I said, "There's nothing to talk about, sweetheart. It's mine." It will stay mine until I decide otherwise. If you and Marcus want to come visit, you are always welcome. If Marcus needs it to be something other than a place our family loves, then he can find that somewhere else." She was quiet. Then she said, "He's not going to be happy." I said, "I know, but I've decided that's not something I can fix." There was a long pause, and then she laughed. Just a small laugh, surprised almost. "Okay, Mom," she said. "Okay, yeah, okay." Here is what I did with that conversation. I went back up to the cabin the following weekend and I stayed for 5 days. I brought Ruth Ann and I brought 2 other women from my church. Phyllis, who is 71 and recently widowed, and June, who is 66 and has been talking about needing a quiet place to think since her youngest moved out. We sat on that porch every morning with our coffee. We cooked big dinners and ate on paper plates because nobody wanted to do dishes. We walked down to the creek one afternoon, and Phyllis took off her shoes and put her feet in the water and made a sound like she'd been holding her breath for years. On the last morning, June said, "We should do this every spring." I said, "I was thinking the same thing." My will has been updated. Carol handled it. The cabin will go, when I'm gone, to Gwen outright. Not to Gwen and Marcus, to Gwen. She'll do what she wants with it then, and that's her right. But until that day it belongs to me, and I will decide who sleeps in it and when. Marcus and I have not spoken directly since March. Gwen and I talk every week. She doesn't bring up the cabin. I don't bring it up. We talk about her kids and my garden and a book she's reading and whether or not I'm going to get a dog, which I am seriously considering. Last month I drove up to Asheville by myself on a Tuesday for no reason at all. I stopped at the same exit where Gerald and I used to get gas, and I bought a bad cup of coffee and stood in the parking lot for a minute just feeling the mountain air. Then I got back in the car and drove the rest of the way. The creek was loud from all the spring rain. I could hear it before I even opened the car door. I stood on the porch, the one with the railing posts Gerald spent 2 summers getting right, and I listened to it, and I thought about how he would have loved this particular evening, the light coming sideways through the trees, the ridgeline holding the last of the blue sky. He would have said something I'd tease him for, something too poetic for a mechanical engineer. And I would have laughed and handed him a peppermint from my pocket, and he would have taken it without looking, and we would have just stood there. I reached into my pocket, found one, stood there anyway. I've had a lot of time to think about what happened, not to relitigate it, I'm past that, but to understand it. Because there's something underneath this whole story that has nothing to do with a cabin in the mountains, and I think it's worth saying out loud. What Marcus didn't happen overnight, and that's the part I keep coming back to. It started with a suggestion, just a friendly one, then another, then a plan, then a letter to a lawyer. Each step was small enough that I could tell myself I was overreacting, that I was being too sensitive, that he meant well. And that's how it works, isn't it? The things that cost us the most don't usually arrive all at once. They walk in slowly, dressed like help. I let it go on too long. That's my honest accounting of it. Not because I was weak. I don't think I was weak, but because I confused keeping the peace with keeping what was mine. Those are not the same thing. I know that now in a way I didn't know it before. There is a version of being agreeable that is actually a form of abandoning yourself, and I had been practicing that version for months without realizing it. The morning I sat on that porch in April and made my decision, nothing dramatic happened. No lightning, no revelation. I just got tired of being afraid of my own daughter's disapproval. And when I looked at it plainly, when I really held it up and examined it, I realized the disapproval wasn't even hers. It was his. She had borrowed it, and I had been rearranging my entire sense of self to accommodate something that wasn't even authentically coming from my own child. That's when I understood what Ruth Ann meant when she said they were using the language of help to describe taking, because the cruelest version of being taken from isn't when someone grabs, it's when they make you feel guilty for holding on. Gerald built things with his hands and his patience, and he taught me, by example, that the things worth having are the things worth protecting, Not with anger, not with bitterness, but with clarity, with a steady voice and a straight spine and the willingness to say, "This is mine, and I know its value, and I'm not letting it go." I think that's what this whole experience gave me, underneath all the grief and frustration. It gave me clarity. I know exactly what I'm willing to lose and what I'm not. I know which relationships I'll fight for and which boundaries I'll hold even when it costs me something. I know that loving someone, even your own child, does not mean handing them whatever they reach for. Gwen and I are fine. We are genuinely fine. And I think part of the reason we are fine is because I didn't fold. Because she needed to see her mother stand up, even if she didn't know she needed that. Even if it made her cry on a Sunday night. The cabin is still mine. The creek is still loud in the spring, and next April, Ruth Ann and Phyllis and June are already asking about dates. Some things you hold on to, not out of stubbornness, out of love, for the man who picked out those railing posts, for the woman you still have to be.